Good morning. Welcome to all, wherever you may be on the planet this morning and in whatever time zone. My name is Elizabeth Prodromou. I'm a faculty member at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I am the faculty director for our initiative on religion, law, and diplomacy. And we are welcoming you to our annual conference on this year on the subject of Ukraine is not yet dead, religion, pluralism, and geopolitics in Eurasia. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy and the Student Club on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. And the club has taken the lead on this annual conference as they do every year. And I want to thank all of the club leadership, the student club leadership, and also the internship support. Francois Venn, Chris Pomford, Ben Drolet, Juliana Rohrdoff, Cecilia Rosenman, Thomas Krush, and our Angel, who has not been with us this year, and I say Angel because she's happily stood with us through this whole thing. She just has graduated from the Fletcher School, Siobhan Kennedy, who was part of the founding idea for this year's conference. It's a pleasure to welcome now the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Dean Rachel Kyte, who will welcome you all to the conference. Just a few technical points. Throughout the conference, the chat function will be turned off. We will have a Q&A function which is active, so please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A. We have 4 panels. The first on contested histories, narrative, and identity in Ukraine. That is at 10 a.m. The second panel on religious ecosystem, pluralism, freedom, and civil society. That's at 11:45 a.m. We have a keynote with Ambassador John Herbst. That's at 1:30 to 2:30. And then our final panel and closing at 2:45, the Geopolitics of Eurasia, with the closing immediately after at 4:15. That's the run of show for the day. And it's now my pleasure to introduce Dean Rachel Kyte, who is the 14th Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And she is an expert in sustainable development, in climate change. Prior to joining the Fletcher School, she actually served as the special representative of the UN Secretary General on these issues. She was a chief executive officer of Sustainable Energy for All. She was previously a World Bank Group vice president and special envoy for climate change, leading the Bank Group's efforts to shift its operations and to campaign for the Paris Agreement. Dean Kyte has been extraordinarily supportive of the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, realizing that religious literacy is key to training leaders who are innovative, imaginative, and impactful in some of the most complex problems facing all of us today in international relations. So Dean Kyte, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Prodromou, and thank you for the invitation to be able to welcome you all to this 5th annual conference of Fletcher's Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. I am so delighted that that one of the jewels in the much jeweled crown of Fletcher is this focus on religion and diplomacy. I think it's incredibly important as a tool for each of the Fletcher students to have some facility with. The dexterity that you require to be an international leader in this day and age, as probably was the case all through the ages, requires some introspection and some study and familiarity with how religion plays out in some of the more complex challenges that the world faces at the moment. And so it's really wonderful to be able to host a conference with a title of Ukraine is not yet dead, obviously pulling from the 19th century poem that forms the national anthem, or the first sentence of that national anthem, in and of itself speaking to the rich, multifaceted religious and cultural traditions that find themselves in the part of the world which is today Ukraine. Pluralism, geopolitics, religion then have waxed and waned across Eurasia for most of history. And at this particular moment in time, as the tectonic plates of the world shift yet again, it's really important that we can take this time and bring deep study and deep thought to these issues. I too would like to thank the students that have pulled this conference together with Professor Prodrumo's leadership. We have a proud tradition of student-led scholarship and interrogation of complexity at Fletcher through student-led conferences, and this is one of the ones that we're very proud of. I'm also delighted that we've been able to assemble such an extraordinary group of world-class scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. I think it's very important for us at Fletcher as we push out into the world the next generation of leaders that we can bring practitioners and scholarship together. You bring to this conference extraordinary breadth in your understanding of the themes of today's conference. First, the remarkable religious and ethnic diversity of Ukraine, pointing to the ways that faith-based communities do and can participate constructively or otherwise in building the kinds of inclusive society and representative politics that are associated with stable, healthy democracies. And second, the Ukrainian geospace as best understood in terms of both territorial and religio-cultural dimensions. And it's in the interaction of these two dimensions that we think we can best understand Ukraine's significance to the broader geopolitical developments in Eurasia as a whole. I'm really delighted that we are welcoming to this year's conference as the keynote speaker, Ambassador John Herbst, who preceded his distinguished diplomatic career in the US Foreign Service by earning his Masters of Law and Diplomacy here at the Fletcher School in 1978. His life of service is an exemplar of everything that we try to achieve at Fletcher. And you know, that service, I think, was really reflected in his commitment and contribution to the centrality of diplomacy and world peace. And I'm really looking forward to hearing how he frames issues in his comments later today. You know, Ukraine is of particular significance at this particular moment in time as relations between the EU, NATO, the United States, the relationship of Europe to Asia, all are in tremendous flex. We have obviously important elections coming up. We have important shifts in balance on display, and we have, as we look further south in Ukraine, we can also see those ruptures that come from the papering over of the cracks, or the failure to paper over cracks, or to solve issues of dissent. As we look at Nagorno-Karabakh and elsewhere, we have a deep commitment to Eurasia at Fletcher over many, many decades. We have a deep commitment to religion and diplomacy and peace. And so I really hope that we can tease out today every aspect or an understanding of different aspects of this diverse ecosystem. You know, a country that sits where it does in the world with the deep traditions of Ukrainian and Russian Orthodoxy, Greek Catholic, Jewish, Muslim, and other groups, and really look at what that means in the complex, continual process of building democracy and investing in continual efforts of peace building. Sitting in the United States, we know far too well what happens when we take for granted the mechanisms and the structures that are necessary for peace, for democracy, and for the ability to exercise fundamental rights. And so it's with humility that the Fletcher School looks at this part of the world and its complexity. So taken all together, I really hope that this conference adds to the importance of religion, law, and diplomacy at Fletcher. Religious literacy, as Professor Prodrumo said, is an important part, we believe, of the practice of leadership and global affairs. I'm proud of the Student Club. I'm delighted that you're all joining us today. I have to go back to more mundane matters of administration of the school, but I wish you well, and I look forward to your interventions. Fletcher is a place where we are not afraid to front up to complexity in all of its dimensions, and I'm delighted that we're hosting this conference today. Thank you very much.
Dean Kyte, thank you very much for being with us. And I mentioned at the outset that you are representative of what we think about in terms of the Fletcher School, leaders who are imaginative, innovative, and impactful. And you represent that for us. So thank you for opening the conference for us and laying out the terrain for today. It's a pleasure to have had you with us, even momentarily, and we wish you a good day. And the conference is actually being recorded, so if you have a moment during the day, you may see the live streaming, but certainly the conference proceedings will be available afterwards. Thank you very much. We wish you a good day. I'm Professor Prodromo. You heard me moments ago. I direct the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy at the Fletcher School. I welcome you to our first panel of the day in our conference. And this is our panel on contested histories, narrative, and identity in Ukraine, the intersection of religion and geography. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Christopher Miller, who will be the moderator and discussant for this panel. Professor Miller is an assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School, so he is perfectly positioned to introduce this panel and serve as discussant, talking about the significance of history to past, present, and future when we think about the geospace of Eurasia and also Ukraine as part of that broader geospace. And one more time, I want to thank all of our student club leaders, Siobhan Heekin-Kennedy, Christopher Pomford, Francois Ben Drolet, Lark Escobar, Gabby Borenstein, Cecilia Rosenman, Thomas Crush, Shireen Shah, Will and Shelby Sanger. Okay, take it away, Professor Miller.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that introduction, and thanks to all of our panelists for joining what I think will be a fascinating discussion on the topic of contested histories, narrative, and identity in Ukraine, the intersection of religion and geography. We have three very distinguished speakers to give us their thoughts on these themes today. First, Professor Serhii Plokhii, the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. Second, Dr. Nicholas Denysenko, professor of theology at Valparaiso University. And then finally, Professor Oksana Shevel, an associate professor of political science with us at Tufts University. So I'll begin by giving each of our panelists around 10 minutes for opening comments, and then we'll have the last hour of our discussion for both discussion between the panelists, some questions from me, which I suspect their comments will spark, but also questions from you in the audience. And you can enter any questions you have using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I'll pick up questions as we go and put them to all of our panelists or to a specific panelist if there's one person that you'd like to direct your question to in particular. So feel free to begin entering questions whenever they come up, and I'll, towards the second half of our time together, begin putting them to the panelists. But let's begin with Professor Plokhii. The floor is yours, Professor Plokhii.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for this introduction, and thanks to the organizers of the conference and the panel. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be part of this undertaking. What I'm going to talk about will be about religion and how it is related to geography, in particular to region in Ukraine. Dean Kyte just mentioned that there are really historic changes that take place in the region today. In Ukraine is right in the middle, right in the center of those changes. With the annexation of the Crimea by Russia, with ongoing hybrid war in Donbass, you see major shifts in identity, in attitude of people toward the state, toward history. And again, religion is an important part of those changes and those transformations. I can tell you that, and a lot of attention will be paid to that particular development. For the first time since the 17th century, there is an emergence of a new internationally recognized Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So rebuilding and restoration contacts that were with Constantinople that were really cut back in the 17th century. So if you talk about the church, it's always longue durée. And in this case, again, we bring together 17th century and 20th century. I will try to map those changes in terms of the religious institutions and where there are transfers from one confession, from one, not confession, but from one church to another happening. And I will rely on the work that has been done by my colleagues at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where for a number of years there is an ongoing project which is called MAPA, Digital Atlas of Ukraine. And recently, really the last year, year and a half, a new module was developed in the MAPA project, and the module that deals with religion. I will try to use a couple of minutes of my time, of my presentation, to bring you to that website and show where you can go if you're interested in, learning more about what is being done in that area. So this is the opening page of the website of Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. If you go under resources, you will see MAPA Digital Atlas of Ukraine. You can click on that, and then if you go down, you see the modules that are there. The most recent one is on Donbass and Crimea through the eyes of Ukrainian regions. The Great Famine Project, that's where we started. And then there is a religious revolution. So you can click on religious revolution and go down to the web map. You click on the web map, and what you get there is the map of, first of all, there are actually information about where the data comes from. So our partner institutions like St. Gallen Project, Religion, Nation, and Beyond, where the data comes from that we then map. And then you get to the map per se, and you can, again, there is Donbass, there are history and identity module, language, religion. You can click on religion. You want to show oblast centers, annexed Crimea, occupied territories. It will all be there. And here is a legend that tells you what you are getting there and what pops up. You can go to statistics, let's say, and there are two different kind of maps, color-coded maps, and you can look, for example, at the religious organizations in 2014, and that's how they show up. Again, if you go to the legend, it will describe you exactly what those colors mean. And then you can go to the chart maps, right? Because again, if you have other data that you want to show here, and it's in color, it's these polygons. So there will be black color going on the orange, and you will not see much and wouldn't be able to compare anything. But with the chart maps, again, it's again, I will not spend time enlarging that. It all fall in the right proportion, but you can see then, let's say, the level of religiosity or the attitudes toward particular political parties in the background, and with the columns there would be shown allegiance to a particular church and then change over time. It's one of the elements of the module. There is another one that shows in time the transfers of the parishes from the Moscow Patriarchate to the newly created in 2018-2019 Orthodox Church of Ukraine. And there is a story map where you actually can go from one map to another, and it explains what you see there. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show all of that now, but again, for those who are interested, it's relatively easy to operate. At least that is our hope, that it is relatively easy to operate and to use our maps. The maps are very good and important, first of all, in terms of presentation of the results of the research that was already done, but second, for the formulation of particular hypotheses. And I'm going to use the second part of my presentation to show you how those hypotheses can be created on the basis of the maps that we have. What you see now is the map of Ukraine, a little bit cut off. Again, I did a poor job in doing that, but again, you see where the transfer of the parishes was taking place. Again, the church was officially created at the Sobor, at the Council of the Church in December of 2018. The transfer of the parishes started a little bit early, and then it continued through the good part of 2019. It then slowed down and stopped for a number of reasons, and Professor Shevel will be talking about that. But again, what I'm trying to do here is to show that actually this is the process that comes from below. So there is no particular government decree saying, okay, that this church in this oblast, in this region should go one way or another. So it depends all on the decision of the communities. And that there is a particular pattern that most of these transfers are taking place in the region that I would designate as a central and parts of Western Ukraine. If you then try to make sense out of what is happening there and ask question why they're happening in one place but not another, other sets of maps coming from our different other modules can be of help. And this is the map, red versus blue. These are the elections, the last pre-war, pre-Maidan elections in Ukraine, where this areas voted for Mrs. Tymoshenko, which was mostly kind of a national democratic agenda. And this areas voted over 50% for Mr. Yanukovych. In this darker areas, the vote for either Tymoshenko or Yanukovych was over 75%. And what you basically can see if you compare the maps of the transfer of the parishes and this map, you'll find that most of the transfers of the parishes are taking place in this red area, which was already in Tymoshenko's column. What you see here also, apart from this colored polygons, are the cases where monuments to Vladimir Lenin were demolished. And again, it looks like that the transfer of the parish is happening also in the same area where the monuments to Lenin are demolished. Again, the map shows the demolition of the monuments to Lenin before the laws were passed by the Ukrainian parliament. So again, these things are happening from below, not by a decree, not by a decision of the government. So the same process in that sense as the transfer of the parishes. So again, one hypothesis there is that the transfer of the parishes happens also in the area where there is a rejection of a particular type, communist or maybe pro-Russian historical narrative. We can move to this map, which shows in the background, the color, the degree of the support for the demolition of the monuments to Lenin. And then in columns, it shows you the support for the recognition of the fighters of the Ukrainian insurgent army during the Second World War as fighters for Ukrainian independence. So again, you can think about formulating a hypothesis that there is also not just the rejection of a particular type of a Soviet narrative, but there is also an embracement of a particular type of national narrative, historical narrative that is there. And again, these are also the areas where the transfers take place. And finally, I know that I'm running out of time. My last map, what you see in the background, the color maps, is the number of the religious communities of Moscow Patriarchate per 100,000 population. And you can see that the presence of the Moscow Patriarchate is the strongest, again, in the same region. We would probably think that the Moscow Patriarchate would be the strongest in the East. This is not the case, partially because of relatively low level of religiosity in the East and high in the West. So really the stronghold of the Moscow Patriarchate is in the West. And these are also the areas where the most of transfers are taking place. So it's the places where the Moscow Patriarchate is the strongest, where it is hit by those transfers. Well, what we know is that the number of people in Ukraine who associated themselves or affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate fell between the years 2014 and 2018 from 22% to 11%. Again, something to think about the impact of the war on the Moscow Patriarchate and how it is popular or not popular with the general population. What you see in columns there, the blue will be the colors of the support for Kievan Patriarchate, or affiliation with the Kievan Patriarchate, the church that preceded the new church created in 2018, 2019, between 2013 and 2018. And you see that the number of people who affiliate themselves, associate with the Patriarchate, Kiev, are growing, and the number of people affiliated or associated with Moscow are going down. And this is true for this area. So basically for the entire area in Western Ukraine. The most significant drop is in Bukovina. That's also the place from where the leader of the new United Ukrainian Orthodox Church is coming from. One thing that you see clearly here, that the Maidan protests, the war really contributed to the shift in attitude of population, in particular of Central and Western Ukraine, toward history, historical narratives, and attitudes toward the church institutions. And with that overwhelming affiliation with the Kiev versus Moscow, that provides a particular background also for the historical and otherwise for the transfers that again will be at the center of the discussion of my colleagues, and I think we'll have an opportunity to return to that and maybe to these maps as well as we move on with our program. Thank you very much for your attention and for your patience. I guess I went a little bit over time.
Great, thank you very much, Professor Plokhii, for those comments. We'll turn now to Professor Denysenko for his remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. It's truly a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful for the invitation from the Fletcher School, and it's an honor to be here with this distinguished panel this morning. Let me just begin by stating a fact. The divisions that separate Orthodox Christians in Ukraine contribute to tensions and conflicts among Ukrainian citizens and between Ukraine and Russia. So I will be devoting my time this morning to explaining the problem, how Orthodox Ukrainians came to be so divided, by referring to contending interpretations of key historical events. So as we just heard, there are two Orthodox churches that constitute a majority in Ukraine's multi-religious landscape. The UOC-MP, Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, has the most parishes and clergy. And they also have limited privileges of self-governing. Their official status is autonomous, which is not completely independent. The Orthodox Church of Ukraine, or OCU, has about 7,000 parishes. It is completely independent, or autocephalous, which is the technical term for independence, and claims to have the majority of Orthodox faithful in Ukraine. I'm now going to present a description of how the two churches view one another through the lens of the so-called other as a dangerous adversary. These views of the other set the stage for understanding how religious narratives exacerbate division among Ukrainian people. The UOC-MP has a profile of the OCU as the opposing other. So from the perspective of the UOC-MP, the OCU is illegitimate because its leaders had been excommunicated from the church and were not recognized by global orthodoxy in the preceding historical period, schismatic and revolutionary and unfaithful to Orthodox tradition, nationalistic, prone to fascism, and too cozy with certain Ukrainian political groups, and unionist, having an agenda to unite the Orthodox with the Roman Catholic Church and also to secularize Ukraine through the European Union. That was the UOC-MP's profile of the OCU. Now let's flip this and present the OCU's profile of the UOC-MP as the adversarial other. From the OCU's perspective, the UOC-MP is illegitimate, not the rightful heir of the medieval Kievan Church, traitors to Ukraine because of their neutral stance on the war in Donbass, a satellite of the Russian Federation, also willing promoters of the Ruski Mir ideology, and controlled by oligarchs who are loyal to Putin. These two profiles of the other are the results of events that unfolded in extraordinarily chaotic circumstances caused by epic geopolitical changes and disproportionate power dynamics in society and church. So let us now very briefly review some of the most important of these changes. Starting with 1917 to 1921. That short period of time was like an earthquake in the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. Relations between independent-minded Orthodox Ukrainians and bishops loyal to the Moscow Patriarchate escalated beyond the threshold of tolerance. Some of the Orthodox Ukrainians responded to the bishop's attempt to remove them from their participation in an all-Ukrainian council through subversive methods. One of these methods or tactics was the convocation of a council in Kyiv that took place from October 14 to 30 in 1921, when Orthodox Ukrainians who wanted church independence created their own church by using innovative methods. They named this church the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, or UAOC for short. This 1921 council established a pattern for this kind of initial profile of the other that I've just referred to in modern Ukrainian church history. Back then, in 1921, the Moscow Patriarchate depicted the UAOC as separatist innovators who betrayed Orthodox tradition and sympathized with the Soviets. For their part, the UAOC declared the Moscow Patriarchate as having committed apostasy, having betrayed Christ in exchange for their longstanding loyalty to the Tsar. They also claimed that the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate had orphaned adherence to the Ukrainian church. And there's one much more important element here that threads through the entire history that I'd like to mention. The UAOC introduced the use of modern vernacular Ukrainian in their liturgical practices and their worship. And they also publicly promoted their Ukrainian church as a preferable alternative to the, quote, old Slavonic one. The most important features then from this profile of the adversarial other, from this initial sequence of events, are the themes of betrayal and illegitimacy. And I would argue that the most important problem that emerged from these initial divisions of 1917 to 1921 is the breaking of trust. Neither side trusted the other. My second example comes from the immediate post-World War II period. Following the Yalta Agreement and the reconfiguration of borders in 1946, Stalin orchestrated a council of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, UGCC, that voted for reunion with the Moscow Patriarchate. For sure, this is a pseudo-council. It was a means of forcing all Ukrainians to belong to one church structure in the Soviet Union, which was the Moscow Patriarchate. The Moscow Patriarchal bishops hailed this 1946 pseudo-council as the final reunion of the separated principalities of ancient Rus, referring to the 1654 Treaty of Pereyaslav as the initial reunion of Ukraine with Russia in documents published in Pravoslavny Vestnik, or the Orthodox Herald periodical of the church in Ukraine. The Soviet defeat of the Nazis in the 1946 Pseudo-Synod of Lviv, from this perspective of the Moscow Patriarchate, liberated Greek Catholics from the clutches of fascism and the legacy of Vatican expansionism. So the narrative said that the political union went hand in hand with church reunion. The official narrative of the Moscow Patriarchate in the post-World War II period claimed that just as the USSR unified the previously divided parts of Ukraine the Moscow Patriarchate reunited people who had been estranged from their native church because of a legacy of Catholic aggression pursued by the West. Now, when the end of the Soviet period approached, the UGCC and the UAOC returned to Ukraine, and their return inevitably resulted in disputes over parish properties and renewed debates over which church is a legitimate Ukrainian church. These debates reignited the flames of polemical warfare and the events reviewed earlier, as well as those from the 15th to 17th centuries, and they grew in importance as foundations for narratives that defined one church in opposition to another. In the post-Soviet period, the UOC-MP and the UOC-KP, which Dr. Plokhii just mentioned, the Kievan Patriarchate, sustained the tradition of depicting one another as illegitimate traitors until the new earthquake shook Ukraine and its churches, the Maidan, annexation of Crimea, and war in Donbass in 2013-14. The Maidan and the war challenged the churches to respond. The Kiev Patriarchate, UOC-KP, blamed Russia as the aggressor, and the leader of the Kievan Patriarchate, Patriarch Eflriede, called Putin a new Cain, guilty of the sin of murdering his innocent brother. After a brief period when union of the churches actually seemed possible, the UOC-MP adopted a neutral stance on the war and withdrew from negotiations, adopting an inward-oriented defensive posture. Their retreat inward was moved in part by the public informational warfare waged by Moscow Patriarch Kirill and Metropolitan Hilarion of the Moscow Patriarchate. Kirill and Hilarion blamed Greek Catholics and Orthodox schismatics, they had the UOC-KP in mind, for inflaming nationalistic passions that they claimed caused the Maidan and the war in Donbass. As the war took its toll on Ukraine, then President Poroshenko, a member of the UOC-MP and parliament, appealed to a convocation of all of the Orthodox churches, at least most of them, in Crete, which is known as the Holy and Great Council of Crete, asking them to grant autocephaly or independence to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. One thesis of their appeal is worth citing here. Quote, Ukraine will never be either a political or church colony of Russia, end quote. Now, the Council of Crete did not act on this appeal, but Poroshenko pursued autocephaly relentlessly and succeeded in persuading Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople and his synod to attempt to unite the Ukrainian churches and create an autocephalous OCU. However, the UOC-MP steadfastly refused to join this newly unified church. The OCU and UOC-MP became embroiled in a tug of war as parishes, especially in villages, voted on their church affiliation, a process resulting in new outbursts of informational warfare, lawsuits, and even more alienation among the people themselves, as I know we will be hearing more about this shortly. Now, this abbreviated review of the interpretation of these select historical events illuminates three important features that are fault lines of the Ukrainian church crisis. The first is legitimacy. Both sides, the OCU and UOC-MP, claim to be the legitimate heirs of the Kievan church on the basis of interpretation of modern and recent events. The second and third are loyalty and betrayal. The OCU accuses the Moscow Patriarchate of loyalty to Putin, all aggressors who sought to subordinate Ukraine to Moscow. The UOC-MP claims that the OCU and its antecedents were loyal to the Nazis and are now loyal to America, along with another traitor, Patriarch Bartholomew. Loyalty to the wrong external figure, be it Putin or Pompeo, makes one a traitor to the Orthodox Church in this narrative. Now, the third issue returns us to one of the two issues from the original earthquake of the Ukrainian church crisis, and that was language. The OCU is the only significant Slavic church that uses the modern vernacular in worship. Their dogma is identical to the other Slavic churches, but language is a concrete differentiating feature that identifies the other as belonging to the opposing church community. Two brief reflections in conclusion. First, it is essential to understand that one cannot merely dust off these narratives as relics of the past or superfluous. Narratives are formidable sources of creating a profile of one's opponent, and I would argue, are much more powerful when passed on locally in a living oral tradition. Negative depictions of the other generate fear and sustain the most painful symptom of the church crisis, a lack of trust. And second, please note that traditional Orthodox ritual methods of reconciliation have been largely ignored in this case. When they have been used, they have been twisted to add more flames to the fire of polemics. Two things are woefully absent from proposals to resolving the Ukrainian church crisis: a desire for reconciliation among the alienated, and an entirely new method that teaches communities how to see their neighbors in a new way. Thank you for your attention and for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Denysenko. We'll turn now to Professor Shovel for her comments.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel, and I'm very glad to kind of be going after Professor Plokhii and Father Denysenko, because we now have sort of broader picture of the Orthodox politics in Ukraine, from going back to historical divides and challenges to kind of broader issues in Ukrainian domestic politics that might have an impact on why we see attempts to transfer affiliation from the Moscow Patriarchate Church to the newly established OCU. So what I'm going to do, and I'm going to share my screen in my presentation in the time that I have today, I'm going to kind of zoom in into specifics of domestic developments in Ukraine, and specifically this process of reaffiliation of the, by now about 600 parishes. This is the map Professor Plokhii already showed us, right, that have voted to transfer affiliation from UOC MP to the OCU. What I found very interesting, and this has been the bulk of my research over the last year, is that in fact, majority of these attempts to affiliation were really just a vote by residents of the communities in question. And for the most part, I should emphasize, there is actually also a way to generate it on the map at the Huri website, to see that the vast majority of these are rural parishes. In other words, this conflict and contestation over attempted reaffiliation of a parish from one Orthodox denomination to the other seems to be primarily affecting Ukrainian rural areas where there is just one church. And that sort of makes sense if we think about it, because in urban centers, when there is more than one church, Orthodox believers have a choice, where to go worship. But if we're talking about a rural area with just one church, whether that church belongs to UOC MP or OCU becomes very important. So again, like literally almost exclusively, these are rural areas. So, and what basically has been happening, that essentially almost all of these attempts of reaffiliation remain contested in courts. In other words, yes, the community voted to switch, but then if we actually say that this process has been completed in legal and administrative sense within the Ukrainian law, this is actually not the case. UCMP contests almost all of these. They have their own statistics, and I was able to get a sense from the interviews that I did last summer in Kiev that with very few exceptions, they basically consider the vote to switch illegitimate. I'll get to the reasons why. It sort of again goes to different interpretations of some key terms, such as religious community, membership in a religious community, a meeting of a religious community. And basically we see this continued contestation. And I would say that what I try to investigate both reasons behind it and kind of broader implications of this contestation for church-state relations in Ukraine and for the future of both churches, especially OCU in this regard. So what I'm finding out, and I'm going to talk about these things briefly, that there are several factors and what I call them multi-level ambiguities that exist at the level of individual belief and the practice of Orthodox faith in Ukraine, at the level of legislation, state legislation, and also at the level of community documents themselves, specifically the statutes or the charters of Orthodox religious community, that generate this ambiguity about the very essence of what it means to be an Orthodox, what is a religious community, what is a meeting of a religious community that by law is empowered to change the community affiliation. And these multi-level ambiguities, to my understanding, generate certain consequences that I'm going to talk a little bit in my few minutes today. And there is sort of, to some extent, both a problem and a silver lining. The problem, to jump to the conclusion a little bit, is that this multi-level ambiguity creates essentially a possibility for local bureaucrats to apply the law quite selectively, and which in turn allows them to use their own personal and religious preferences. And we see that happening in the way both local authorities and local courts decide these reaffiliation disputes. But at the same time, this ambiguity is also such that none of the actors with stakes in this process, be it central government, be it local authorities, be it any two of the competing churches, can reliably harness this ambiguity to the advantage. So what results instead in Ukraine, and for experts on Ukraine, it probably won't be news to say that this sort of religious pluralism by default. We've heard pluralism by default when with regard to situation in Ukrainian kind of democratization more generally and presence of competitive politics, despite many obstacles and despite the fact that this democratic contestation often takes ugly forms. And I would say we see the same as far as Orthodox politics. This sort of religious pluralism by default, I would argue, remains. It has been the feature under Poroshenko, who has not been fully able to accomplish the objectives that he set, and I think it continues under Zelensky. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about this, right? So let me start with ambiguity at the level of individual beliefs. In the practice of Orthodoxy, unlike in some other religious denominations, traditionally there has been no fixed parish membership. And many Ukrainians, I'm going to go here for a second to the opinion polls, identify themselves as simply Orthodox. What it means remains to be, it's debated by sociologists and anthropologists. So there is this tendency that Professor Plokhii already talked about of more and more people over time considering themselves to support or to belong to Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kiev Patriarchate, and by the same time there is a decline in those who consider themselves belonging to Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchy. But that doesn't mean this is not the same, that doesn't necessarily reflect institutional strength of the church. UCMP remains institutionally stronger with more parishes, organizations, and so forth, although they have lost progressively support. But what is really interesting that there is this large number, and it's actually plurality, a majority in all regions except the West, who identify as simply Orthodox. Again, I don't have time to go into it, but there is sociological research, anthropological research, and sort of the lived faith and lived Orthodox practices in Ukraine that really shows this ambiguity, fluidity, kind of people not necessarily being even able to definitively say where they belong or sort of changing their perceptions and so forth, right? So this is at one level. On the other level, right, this ambiguity in terminology in the law. What constitutes religious community in Ukrainian Religijna Hromada is defined very broadly. What constitutes, therefore, a meeting of religious community is also open to interpretation. Orthodox parish statutes themselves typically define criteria of regular attendance as criteria for membership, but do not further specify what regular attendance means. And also importantly to keep in mind that since already starting in the early 1990s, within the UCMP, and it actually starts from the processes in Russia, there has been this sort of centralization drive to make the institution of the church much more hierarchical and basically take some of the powers from local religious communities, the parishes, and give these powers to the bishop. And that it comes actually in conflict with Ukrainian legislation, whereby Ukrainian law defines parishes as individual legal entities with certain rights to dispose of their property and make various decisions. So when UCMP in the years already before Euromaidan, and then it actually accelerated in the last, since 2015, tried to re-register the parish statutes that essentially made any kind of transfer of affiliation outright impossible unless the bishop would approve it. And of course, UCMP bishops would not approve these transfers. Whether or not these statutes were registered, in fact, by local authorities varied greatly. I tried to kind of get a sense if there was a systematic variation, as in, say, like, pro-Western oblasts refusing to register these sort of more centralized statutes and, more pro-Russian, quote-unquote, Eastern oblasts registering them. And that's not the impression I came with. It seemed to be, it was really context-dependent on local bureaucrat. So anyway, so by the time Thomas comes about, right, and OCU is created, we have the situation where statutes Some of them still sort of leave the authority with the parishes. Some of them already transferred to the bishops. And it's actually not clear if the statutes that deprived parishes of the ability to make decisions such as transfer affiliations were or were not in conflict with Ukrainian legislation. So then when the votes came about, when communities began to vote, that we saw in the slides that both Professor Plokhii and I just shared, the two churches took very different position. So position of UCMP basically became that community decision to switch vote was not a valid vote because it was quote unquote territorial community and not a religious community that was voting to switch. Further, many UCMP priests, and it has also been the official position, at least based on my interactions with their spokespeople, that it's only the priest who gives communion, who is in a position to say who does and who does not belong to a religious community. Clearly, not surprisingly, this position has been disputed by OCU and also by many people in the Ukrainian Poroshenko government who favored OCU and wanted to facilitate the transfer process. Legislation has been amended to make it possible, right? And essentially, we have this very conflicting interpretation, right? I'm not going to go into detail for the sake of time now, but if anybody is interested in kind of legal nuance as how exactly general meeting of religious community may or may not be the same thing as a parish meeting, which actually becomes very important in these court disputes. I'm happy to address it in the Q&A. So we have these very conflicting positions, right? Each appealing to vague legislation, each appealing to the statutes, which by themselves may or may not be fully in accordance with state legislation. We have also to add to it precedents of courts ruling differently on similar issues within Ukraine. So the outcome, and I'm going to be here, trying to wrap up, since I know we have short time, that this ambiguity really empowered state actors at local levels to apply the law to the benefit of either UCMP or OCU. And we do see this sometimes at the level of the same village, where, say, the village head would be in favor of transferring from UCMP to the OCU, and say the Rayon administration head would be against. They would endorse competing protocols of competing meetings, and then the state authority at that oblast would receive two protocols, each supposedly representing meeting of parishioner. One say we want to switch, one say we don't want to switch. So essentially kind of the burden was placed on these local bureaucrats. Now, that said, right, again, from the research that I did, it seems like no party in this conflict could reliably harness this ambiguity to their own advantage. So again, we see that sometimes OCU was able to kind of get their way, sometimes UCMP was able to get their way, and I would argue, and again, I'm going to leave it for the sake of brevity and time, that this is not likely to change under Zelensky. Again, we see sort of similar ambiguity happening during his rule. Some feared that kind of more pro-MP people in his immediate entourage would be able to push, say, certain appointments that they favor. That has not come to pass. Sometimes compromise candidates is appointed. Here I'm thinking more of the recent appointment to the head of this state committee on religion, the main central government organ, right? And just to conclude, I think it raises broader question, at least to my mind, it is kind of almost like a philosophical issue, not so much about, concrete law and policy. What exactly state neutrality should look like, right? If we say that the state should be neutral in its interaction with the church, right? But in the absence of this legal ambiguity that I would argue in Ukraine probably cannot be ever fully resolved, right? State ambiguity might actually produce the consequence when a better funded party, better organized party, which in this case is certainly UCMP as far as kind of their financial administrative capacity, may be able to get their way in this context of this ambiguous legislation. Is this an okay consequence of state neutrality, or should state do something else? So I'm going to sort of leave it at that. Maybe this is something we can talk about all together and think of what state neutrality should look like in these particular domestic circumstances. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Professor Seville. We'll now turn to some discussion and questions from the audience. I've gotten some questions in both via the Q&A feature and also some chatted directly to me. I'll encourage audience members to toss any questions you have in the Q&A feature, and I'll pick them up and put them to our panelists. But let me start with a couple of questions from my end. And maybe, Professor Seville, I'll start with you. You ended on this really interesting note about state ambiguity versus state neutrality. And I think these are concepts which are not necessarily agreed upon by all people in Ukraine. But even if you were to imagine a policy of state neutrality in practice which, as you said, is not necessarily what we have today. What would that look like in a context where the definition of neutrality is, I would imagine, disputed by the different parties that you and your fellow panelists have mapped out so clearly? In such a divided context, how can a state be neutral not only in principle but also in practice?
Yes, thank you, Professor Miller. I actually don't know. I mean, this is why it was a question to me. I was thinking, right, like if, say, like sort of thinking more of political theories of pluralism, right? Like let the 1,000 flowers bloom, right? And 1,000 ideas be there. And then whichever interest group happens to be the strongest, say, right? Or better organized, or is able to raise more money, they sort of win in this context, right? Of state neutrality and competing preferences, and that's okay. And in a way, one might say that might be okay in Ukraine, except of course, as we know, that, the church, especially the Moscow Patriarchy, they're not really purely domestic actor, right? We have, first of all, involvement of the oligarchs, even the sort of their relations with Putin aside, right? We can say these are individuals potentially with ill-gotten money, right? Who can exercise undue influence, right? Who can fund, say, one of these competing interest groups, right? And in the kind of perspective of neutral state, I'm not sure that I would say that this is going to be okay, right? Like, I mean, I think the theory of pluralism in an abstract would say like that should be okay, right? And I think sort of if you look at the other extreme, I think the position of some in the Ukrainian government, and I've talked to a few of these people, is basically exactly the same, to say that it's a state duty to actually support sort of like a weaker actor, right? Like that Ukraine had its share of, problems and colonization and Russian occupation and aggression, and Putin wants Ruski Mir, right? And like some even don't want Ukraine to exist. So in these circumstances, it's actually okay for the government to be more activist and support, OCU in various ways, as the Ukrainian church. I think that's also, kind of probably most would say a problematic position. So I don't have an answer to this. Like I would be actually very interested to hear, if other panelists or audience members, or maybe there is some sort of experience from other cases that could be applied to Ukraine, right? When we have this quite unusual situation, right, of competing groups, and none of them are sort of purely domestic actors, and one is maybe better positioned institutionally, historically, financially, right? Like, do we let it win and call it a day? I don't know. But thank you for the question.
When that debate maps on, I would think in some ways to the linguistic debates in Ukraine as well. The question of is neutrality in theory productive of neutrality in practice, or what role should the state play, if any, in backing one party or the other? Let me turn to Professor Denysenko. You mentioned traditional modes of resolving disputes within the church, and said that these had been sidelined by geopolitical considerations. I'd be interested to hear what the counterfactual history looks like had more traditional dispute resolution mechanisms been used, geopolitics pushed to the side, and traditional or existing church mechanisms used to address these disagreements.
Thank you. I think that if you look at the history of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, in most of the periods, there were attempts to reconcile divisions that looked promising at one point. So, for example, in 1922, the Exarchate of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine not only adopted temporary independence or autocephaly, and also a form of church governance that was aligned with the autocephalous church, but they also called for dialogue with the autocephalous church. But the political conditions of the time didn't make doing anything with that possible. And something similar happened during World War II, when an actual act of union was signed between two camps, the so-called autonomists and the autocephalists, that were trying to gain momentum in renewing Orthodox church life in Ukraine. But that act of union was annulled, and it was certainly not in the interest of the German occupiers for there to be a strong, unified Orthodox church emerge. It was much easier for them to pursue their policy with the Orthodox remaining at odds with one another. And so I think that really there have been numerous opportunities for reconciliation besides simply saying, well, let's have a ceasefire in the polemics and get together and work this out. As recently as 2017, when Patriarch Eflriede, who has certainly been the most controversial figure in the modern history of the Ukrainian church situation, wrote a letter that was publicized to the synod that was meeting in Moscow, and asked for forgiveness, and also said that he would forgive them. That seemed to open the door to the possibility of rapprochement between the opposing sides. They, of course, the joke is, well, a commission is established, which means that nothing will happen. And as one might expect, nothing happened. And so these are some traditional mechanisms. Another traditional mechanism is every year, the Orthodox churches during Lent, they begin Lent with an act of reconciliation. It's typical for people to ask forgiveness of one another and to start a new slate, to kind of begin the season of Lent free of these former divisions. And you see this promulgated from the pulpit, but again, nothing happens. And what's clear is that these methods are, even if they're being promoted, to the faithful, being exhorted to exchange forgiveness with one another, that forgiveness doesn't mean to put an end to the things that happened in the past. Because the problem is that this is kind of like what happens when a family dispute or a family crisis carries on and becomes multi-generational. This is embedded deeply in the historical memory of Orthodox people in Ukraine, perhaps with the exception of these other Orthodox that we heard of and scattered around in this panel discussion today. Maybe they don't want to be involved in this dispute and simply want to practice their faith. But for those who are involved, they make up a significant part of the population, and these disputes carry over. And this is why there need to be new approaches, because the traditional approaches haven't worked. Even when a so-called third party decided to become involved, finally, after 100 years, Patriarch Bartholomew, that only seemed to exacerbate the existing divisions in Ukraine and create some tension among all of the other Orthodox churches that are involved in this matter. The only reason the issue has been quiet recently is because COVID has quieted pretty much all of this discussion down for the time being, but you can be sure that it's still simmering underneath. As to what those new methods are, I'm not sure, although maybe we'll hear proposals for some of those new methods in the next panels. Let me just say, give a plug for some kind of a religious version of couples therapy. At some point you have to come together to talk the issues out and say that for the sake of the common good, for the sake of the people, we have to put to rest the things that divide us and find a way to peacefully coexist without necessarily having some kind of a forced or coerced union.
And could I follow up there? Is there, or what is the specific internal church mechanism that would apply when a dispute can't be solved? After you've had couples therapy, as it were, what would happen next if the dispute isn't resolved?
Well, I think that you're seeing it play out right now. The pro-autocephaly people recognized Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople as holding the authority to be able to adjudicate this issue. So you might think of that as kind of like a legal appeals process, and it's part of the canonical corpus in the Orthodox Church. But the problem is that he acted upon it and interpreted it in the documents, but the other Orthodox churches have their own dispute on whether or not he has the authority to hear appeals. So, for example, the question was, well, what do we do with Patriarch Eflriede and with the Metropolitan Makari of the former UAOC, who had been excommunicated from the church? And the part of Eflriede, it went so far as he was anathematized from the church. He had sent several appeals to Constantinople asking them to overturn this anathematization. And that is precisely what they did in October. I mean, everyone talks about December 2018, but October was the big event that sort of precipitated this conciliar event when there was this historic announcement that came from Patriarch Bartholomew and the Synod of Constantinople, simply saying that they have restored Eflriede and Makari to their positions in the church and ended the alienation of their faithful from communion with the rest of the Orthodox Church. a religious analogy from a political standpoint would be, this is kind of like when one nation recognizes the sovereignty of a nation that declares independence that's in question in the geopolitical sphere. The problem is that not all of the Orthodox agree on this mechanism. So some people have said, well, a third party is necessary. Well, they've tried that, and it may yet play itself out, especially if younger generations decide, yes, we want to pursue peace and we don't want to continue on this era of polemical informational warfare. There may be some hope there, especially if education contributes to that. But I would think that the real key to peace among the Orthodox in Ukraine would be to see if they can agree on, we're not going to force the union of the churches, which could help possibly to resolve this property dispute, but we'll agree to exist or coexist peacefully, which would mean that we would be able to worship in one another's churches without some kind of prohibitions on full participation. That would be the step that I think would be a sort of penultimate step to unity in Ukraine. It's being discussed among some theologians in the church, but again, I think it may have been something that would have been put forward, but obviously COVID put a pause on all of these proposals, like it did seemingly to all other matters of business.
Okay, thank you. And Professor Plokhii, a question for you. You showed images that very clearly laid out the different layers of this dispute. There's the religious layer, there's the geographic layer, there's different histories and different interpretations of history. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how you would respond if a social scientist asked, well, which one of these is most important? Which is the driving factor, and which are responding to this causal factor? Is there a way we can disambiguate the relative importance of religion versus geography versus views on some of the historical questions that you raised, or are they all too impossibly intertwined to say this one is more important and this one less so?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. The importance of religion and religious factor depends on particular region of Ukraine and its history. In the Soviet times, 60% of all the Orthodox parishes of the Moscow Patriarchate were in Ukraine. Those included then Greek Catholic. And my understanding is that until maybe last 15 years, still the Orthodox community, there were more Orthodox parishes in Ukraine than there were in the rest of the Moscow Patriarchate outside of Ukraine. But again, most of them would be in western part of Ukraine. And in that sense, the religion as a part of a broader national identity is much more important factor, I would say, in the central and western parts than it is in the east. Looking at the movement of borders, political, religious, linguistic, and otherwise, my impression is that what you see first is the movement of a political border, in a sense that the region first falls into a particular political column, like Tymoshenko, or they're voting for Yushchenko, and so on and so forth. And then the issues of identity, religious, national, or otherwise, which are more conservative, would be catching up. And with Leninapad, and that's something that comes in response to Maidan. So it comes in 2014, late 2013, 2014. And there is a lag before this movement starts towards the transfer of the parishes. And at least in my opinion, the major factor would be not Maidan, but the war in the East. And the position that the church takes towards in particular early on, whether they would officiate during the funeral of people who were killed and so on and so forth. And Central and Western Ukraine provides a good part of the recruits, of the soldiers who are fighting in the East. So it became certainly a factor. So the war is more of a trigger in terms of the religious transfers than it is in terms of historical narrative, despite the fact that it also influences historical narrative, but the changes started a little bit earlier. And if I can also comment on the issues that were already here discussed between you and Father Denysenko and Professor Serhii, in terms of possible unification. The data that we have, and it is represented in one of our modules, has a question asked to the population in general in Ukraine in terms of future unification and which church should be at the center of that unification, around whom the different Orthodox communities should be unified. And the answer is overwhelming majority was responding in terms of the Kievan Patriarchate and then this United Orthodox Church. But that also reflects the fact that the majority of the population affiliate themselves with those with that particular church. And one other comment, I was thinking about other major division and major split in Ukraine, which happened in the late 80s, early 90s, and this is re-emergence of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in Galician provinces of Ukraine in particular. And again, they constituted the probably around 1989, constituted probably 40% of all the Orthodox parishes that existed in the Soviet Union. So it was a big, big chunk. And in most cases, the split ended with other community which ended to be in minority building a different church, another church. Professor Serhii was saying that again, in the setting of the village, there is not much of a choice between where to go. So they ended up building other churches. So there would be in one village an Orthodox church and Greek Catholic church. I don't see that actually going that way. Again, it's very early on, but I don't see that actually we will see construction of two churches in one village and both churches would be Orthodox. But again, that's something to look at. And again, my main point is that looking at the experience of 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, potentially can maybe help us to understand better what is happening now and think about the future.
Oksana?
Yes, if that's okay, I wanted to actually comment on something Professor Plokhii was saying and ask Father Denysenko a question, because I wonder if that's okay, yeah. I just wanted to kind of follow up on the preferences, right? I think I totally agree that this impact of Euromaidan and the war and kind of like the surge of these, because most of these 600 some churches that switched, parishes that switched, the process began already before. Like, so the law kind of comes later, but kind of like the groundswell comes before. But at the same time, and I think it's very interesting to keep in mind and important, sociological work shows that actually there isn't that much difference in that part of Ukraine, right? We're not talking about central Western Ukraine, in the preferences of people who belong to MP and who belong to OCU. So in other words, for some people at least, right, like who are pro-Ukrainian, who are, support, war effort in the East, who are pro-Euromaidan and so forth, and still remain with the OCU, right? So there is sort of kind of negotiation or renegotiation of belonging at the individual level, right? That pushes a lot, but not everybody, of the same political preferences, right? Towards kind of saying we have to switch the church. And it's actually really interesting. And this is something I plan to do a little bit more research on myself, because there is now wealth of material, these video recordings of these meetings about church transfer process. And I watched some of them, and you see really interesting narratives, how people make an argument as to why their village should belong to the OCU, to the UCMP. And the discussion is often about which church is actually more Ukrainian. So say, like, because the UCMP claims that it's a Ukrainian church, they don't say, like, they're not emphasizing the Moscow Patriarchy, right? The Ukrainian Orthodox Church, right? And they would say that the OCU is actually a Turkish church, right? Or as Father Denysenko was saying, like, you know, supports Pompeo and so forth. So there is sort of this very complicated negotiation of what it at individual level and also at the competing narratives as what it actually means to be a Ukrainian church, right? So I just kind of wanted to comment on that. And then to Father Denysenko, I wanted to ask, like, because I'm not really an expert on kind of churches so much itself, but I came as an impression talking to people in Ukraine last summer that OCU was somewhat more open towards these compromise solutions, like taking turns doing service in the same church, right? In other words, if there is a division at the village level, at least the people I spoke with from the OCU, to me, they would say, like, yes, we wouldn't mind that. And Ukrainian legislation also allows for this. So if there is a dispute over who controls, and there is one parish, like one church building in the village, they could do this. In Ukrainian, it's called Pochergove Bogosluzhinnya, which means like religious services taking turn, right? But the USCMP, again, from what I heard, they would refuse, and I think that was actually Onufri's official position, that they would not go for it. And the argument is exactly because SCU is quote-unquote schismatic, they desecrate the church building by their presence, and therefore you cannot then go in the church building and use the same artifacts, and sort of like the whole building is desecrated. That seems like sort of like, so there is, in other words, there is a legal possibility for compromise. But my impression, and maybe that's wrong because obviously I only talk to a limited number of people, that there isn't much willingness on the part of UCMP to actually, you know, engage in this compromise.
I would like to respond. Thank you. That's a very interesting remark and observation. I don't, you know, I'm a little bit less certain about the willingness of the OCU to share, at least at the official level. I certainly, your comments about what you're hearing on the ground are illuminating, and I'm interested in learning more about that. I certainly think that at the very beginning of the process, there was expectation that there would be many more parishes that would transfer affiliation from the UOCMP to the OCU. And it was rather surprising to most observers that there was such a limited number. And as you mentioned, some of those communities were already in the process of doing so. And even before, some had transferred their affiliation from the UOCMP to the UOCKP before the Unification Council. But what you say about the UOCMP, to me, is affirmation of the fact that from their perspective, the actions that were taken by Constantinople to restore the OCU, which, keep in mind, the vast majority of the OCU is the former UOCKP and the UAOC. Only 2 bishops of the UOCMP joined the OCU. This act of restoring them to communion, of restoring their legitimacy, of annulling any canonical acts that had been imposed upon them in the past, that they were illegitimate. And I think that that notion that they have their heels dug in, that they're not going to relinquish this until something else happens. And at the level of Orthodox discourse, again, up until the beginning of COVID put a pause on all of these activities, they were at a standstill on what, and I mean this in the broader Orthodox community, not only among Ukrainians, about what needed to be done to actually finalize this unification process. One proposal was that all of the clergy of the OCU would have to be reordained. And that was something that was rejected. And the act of Patriarch Bartholomew essentially rendered that completely unnecessary. He essentially recognized their ordinations. That's really a major difference in the 2 positions. Another possibility would be that they would have to repent. At first, that they would have to return to the canonical church. This would mean that the OCU would have to return to the canonical church of the UOCMP, and then they could discuss the possibility of unification and autocephaly. And that also was rejected. The reason for that was that they had accused and actually anathematized Patriarch Eflriede for leading the church into schism. That was the primary cause. That was the main sin that he was accused of leading the church into schism. So I think what you have here is that their heels are dug in, and that is It is a canonical religious identity feature that would prevent the sharing of a temple, which would be the most convenient, easiest way to begin the process of creating peace, of saying two churches use one, as certainly Ukrainians in the diaspora experienced when even Greek Catholics and Orthodox would share the same space without having those canonical obstacles. I think it's important to note that this issue, we're spotlighting the Ukrainians themselves, but it's all of the Orthodox who don't agree, and it's going to be difficult to come to some kind of a consensus on this until we have conditions that permit the churches to begin to discuss these issues anew again.
Professor Plokhii?
Actually, I have a couple of questions. one to Professor Shevel and another to Father Denysenko. It's okay to go ahead with the questions? To Professor Shevel, you were speaking about the state and the role of the state and ability to use this ambiguity. What state we are talking about? So who makes this decision at the end? Whether this is the decisions that are done on the cave level, on the national level, or it's regional? And in that sense, again, we see the end of relatively mass transfers of the parishes that coincides with the elections and new president in Kiev. So my question is whether it's the state on the national level or on the regional level who has more power there. And to Father Denysenko, the question that I have is there were either rumors or speculations or discussions that the Moscow Patriarchate might consider, if the transfers really intensify, might consider granting autocephaly as opposed to independence in administration, full autocephaly to its branch in Ukraine. And there are also concerns that, again, if something like that happens, or if the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate join in mass the Sobor that took place in December, there would be the majority of them, that they would just take over that church. So my question is whether any of those speculations were based on any reality in terms of whether ideas like that were discussed or whether they are discussed today.
Let's perhaps start with Professor Shevel and then turn to Professor Denysenko. And if I could add, Professor Shevel, two questions from the audience that are overlapping in some ways with Professor Plokhi's question. Two audience members noted a potential contradiction or tension, at least, between Ukraine's highly centralized political system and this decentralized and disputed religious system. So is there anything interesting to say about that? And then a second question about who controls what power local bureaucrats have. And again, I think this is a question of where does decision-making lie in different regions or at the center. So if you could comment on those as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, let me kind of very briefly outline this process, and I think it would address both questions. So to Professor Plokhii, right, the laws are made centrally, and that sort of goes to the centralized part of Ukrainian states, right? Like there is no kind of regionally made law on religious affiliations or anything like that. But then the law is applied locally, right? And if there is an ambiguity in the law, like that's exactly where sort of the power of the bureaucrats comes from. So it's unintentional, like all is kind of accidental, right? Like this ambiguity was not kind of on purpose put in there. But how did it arise? Let me just very briefly explain with the Orthodox parishes the way I understood it, from my research. So by Ukrainian law, any 10 adults can find a religious community, right? So, and usually the history of most of these Orthodox parishes that there were the original 10 founders, the so-called Desyatki, right? Who would submit the original documents, right, and register a particular parish. Then often, although not always, these 10 people would also then become, or some part of them, would become kind of part of the parish leadership, right, the Parafialna Rada, the parish council, and so forth. Now, according to the law, it is this parish council, right, that has the right to change statute, including to reaffiliate, right? Potentially you can change statute and say, like, now in our statute, we are going to say we belong to a different church, right? Now, the problem arose exactly because of this centralization drive within UCMP that actually originates in Russia itself, where basically parishes were denied the legal power to do any kind of change without approval of the bishop, right? Now, from the point of view of Ukrainian lawmakers, that created a situation, and I think they're right to say that in theory, in principle, even if like 100% of these parish members want to switch, unless the bishop okays it, it becomes impossible, right? So the Ukrainian lawmakers created this legislation that tried to sort of empower, at least the way it was presented, tried to empower ordinary people, right? Ordinary Orthodox. And if you think of Orthodox life in the parish was one church, right? Like that's why people go on Sunday service, right? Some of them go every Sunday, some go, maybe 2 times a year for Easter and, for Easter and Christmas. They baptize their children there, right? Like they donate to this church, right? Like they bury their family members. So are they or are they not formal members? There is no formal membership list, right? Like from the point of view of many Ukrainians and the state under Poroshenko kind of took this view that all these people should have the power to decide, right? Now, they may not be formal members of Parafialna Rada, of the parish council, right? So if the parish council were to vote, and then the bishop has to approve, you cannot in principle do any transfer, right? Unless the bishop approves, which of course he's not going to approve, right? So then this additional legal sort of ambiguity was introduced. The concept of general meeting of a religious community was added to the Ukrainian law. And it is this general meeting of religious community that has the power to decide. So as you can see, there is immediate contradiction there, right? Like the general meeting of religious community can decide, but its decision is supposed to be in accordance with the statute. And the statute says that it is the parish council that decides, right? Plus, maybe the bishop may cancel that. So this sort of like in this circumstance, and I think this goes to the question kind of like where the local interests come in, right? What basically would happen that the competing groups would bring the set of documents. They said, we held a meeting, say like all villagers gathered, and they're saying this was a general meeting of religious community. And the priest and his supporters, the UCMP priest, would bring protocol of alternative meeting where people kind of closer to the parish, right, who supported staying with the UCMP would have their own meeting and say, no, we are the real meeting, right? And then what does the bureaucrat do? Which one of these two they register? And whichever one they register, maybe based on their personal preferences or their own interpretation of the law, then it's going to be appealed to courts, right? So there is, to my mind, there is no contradiction in terms that, yes, it is centralized system, as in the laws are made centrally, right? But once these laws created these ambiguities, right, which I would say for the most part were unintentional, then it sort of went back to the local actors, as in bureaucrats in the state administration who were supposed to register the statutes, and then the local courts who would decide on these disputes over which of these packet of documents was actually legitimate. And this is where sort of then the power to the bureaucrats came. But what I found out in my research, I want to kind of emphasize this, that nobody can really harness this ambiguity decidedly to their advantage, right? And this is why we have these protracted disputes in courts. And I would say this is actually one of the reasons, not the only reason, but maybe one of the reasons why we don't see more attempts to affiliation, because it is incredibly time-consuming and demanding process, right? Somebody has to go to these courts to fight these things, right, to show evidence. So imagine from like your local person in the village, right, it's one thing you all gather together one time and you vote to switch, and another thing, who is going to accompany then this legal battle, right? And I think in many communities, maybe there were like, people willing to switch, like nobody wants to take on this onerous task of kind of fighting this with uncertain results, right? So, I hope I'm answering the question both of Professor Plokhii and the audience member that there is no kind of contradiction in terms there. Like, yes, there is centralization at the state level, right? But because of these ambiguous provisions that were unintentionally introduced in the legislation and they further interact with ambiguities in the statutes, right, a lot of power ends up with local bureaucrats and local courts.
Professor Denysenko?
Yes, thank you. So, Professor Plokhii, the question about the autocephaly from the Moscow Patriarch to the UOC MP, we certainly know that during the tenure of Patriarch Alexei II that he did consider, and this was on the heels of the momentum for autocephaly that was established after the independence of Ukraine in 1991 with the 2 appeals that went from the episcopate of the church to the Moscow Synod requesting autocephaly, even with the migration, if you will, of Metropolitan Filaret in the creation of the Kievan Patriarchate in 1992, the possibility of autocephaly seemed to still be conceivable up until about 1996. Now, we certainly know that in more recent years, especially on the heels of Maidan, that the issue became rather urgent again. And the one thing that was really interesting was that after the act of Patriarch Bartholomew, and you have this state initiative, really a Poroshenko-led initiative with the cooperation of Constantinople, to try to get everyone on the same page, to try to persuade the Moscow Patriarchate, especially the bishops in Ukraine, to join the unification movement. Even after it seemed that that the UOC MP was left on the outside, there was one now long forgotten initiative that was led by the church in Cyprus. And this was Metropolitan Chrysostomos, who is the leader of the church in Cyprus, who appointed himself to act as a sort of a mediator to try to resolve the situation and account for everyone's perspective. And his suggestion was that Moscow would grant autocephaly to the UOC MP, and that then the two autocephalous churches would decide amongst themselves a path to unification. And of course, there were a number of problems with this, and one of the big problems, if only we had time to get into everything, of course, is the particular statute and the orientation of the OCU. There was a lot of speculation on what would this autocephaly look like. You might note that the OCU has the status of metropolia and not a patriarchate like its antecedents, the Kiev Patriarchate, and for most of its history, the UAOC, at least in the post-Soviet period, was a patriarchate, which at least gives the appearance that they're equal to the Moscow Patriarchate among the Ukrainian public. So now the OCU is a metropolia, so it seems to be somewhat lesser of a status. And there are other things in the statute which seem to not make the OCU subservient to Constantinople, but ask the OCU to defer to Constantinople on matters of faith and doctrine and to receive their chrism, which is used as part of the process of baptism from Constantinople. It became very clear that Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarchate, had a very large stake in granting autocephaly to the OCU and had no interest whatsoever in participating in any negotiations that were led by the Metropolitan of Cyprus or the negotiations that were later attempted in this Amman affair, this sort of mini gathering of Orthodox churches that was headed up by the Patriarch of Jerusalem. So the Orthodox geopolitical attempt, the mechanisms are really still at that standstill. And it's not simply a matter of the Ukrainians don't agree or Moscow will never agree to this, but from the perspective of the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople, the decision is final, and the only chance for unification will be for the parishes and the bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate to eventually become part of the OCU. I do not foresee in the future, and who knows, maybe history will prove me wrong, any change in the position of Constantinople. And that is a significant factor in all of this. I really do think that we're looking at two parallel coexisting Orthodox churches in Ukraine for the foreseeable future. The question is to will there be any movement to try to have a ceasefire and more friendly relations among those churches?
Well, we only have, unfortunately, just a couple of minutes left in our discussion and a number of questions from the audience that we haven't had a chance to answer yet. So maybe in our final 5 minutes, I'll list some of the remaining questions and then hand it over to each of our panelists for a final minute or two of wrap-up comments. So just questions from the audience to start, and I'll summarize them so we can be brief. One, thoughts on how different religious communities of Ukraine, both Orthodox, non-Orthodox, Christian and non-Christian, have responded to the annexation of Crimea and the question of religious minorities in general. Two, question about the specific role of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and its views on disputes within the Orthodox Church and its role in Ukrainian identity. And then 3, a question about whether it's possible to be a Russian-speaking member of the Moscow Patriarchate and be recognized as Ukrainian and to recognize yourself as Ukrainian. So if any of you would like to pick up one or all of those questions, you're welcome to do so, or any final comments. Professor Shevel, we'll start with you.
I'll talk about the last part about kind of perceptions and self-perceptions of what it means to be, right? And I think there is a big difference between these kind of official narratives of what it means, like what is a true Ukrainian church, right? Like, or what it means to be Ukrainian, that say would be kind of the stylized narratives advanced by actors themselves, say like OCUMP or UCMP or OCU. And I think it's a different story about how people kind of at the local level perceive and self-perceive themselves. And I think we see a lot more kind of fluidity, possibility for reconciliation, compromise, and sort of this mix and melange of different identities. So to that question, is it possible? I think a self-perception, certainly, right? Like, I mean, there are certainly people who attend, UCMP, who are Russian speakers and who consider themselves Ukrainian, right? I think that kind of person would fit badly in these more stylized narratives along the lines that UCMP is sort of this like, Putin's church, and anybody who belongs there is somehow, enemy of Ukrainian state, right? And I think this is really the challenge, right? Like how, in a way, like there is this potential for reconciliation. It may be messy, but it's kind of coexistence within the Ukrainian society and how the faithful, how people experience Orthodoxy and sort of what it means to them, right? And to what extent the competing institutions can find a compromise, right? So in a way, maybe some solutions are already present in there. I mean, I heard, for example, again, anecdotally, maybe Father Denysenko can speak more to it, that even the church service language, right? Like, yes, like I think UCMP officially kind of wants to do it in Church Slavonic, right? And OCU wants to do it in Ukrainian and kind of advocates for doing it in Ukrainian. But I heard that in practice, sometimes local UCMP priests would actually do it in Ukrainian because this is what is wanted at their local community level, right? So in a way, they're kind of like violating the church official line, right? But that also allows them to kind of, keep, serve the parishioners who that's what they want, right? So again, I kind of come back to this point, how the ambiguity that exists in Ukraine are sort of both a curse and a blessing, right? They really make it difficult for any of the competing actors to kind of get their way. I would say impossible, but I think at the same time, they create these possibilities for reconciliation and coexistence that are not provided by the official stylized narratives that they're coming from centralized in competing institutions themselves.
Great, thanks so much. Professor Denysenko.
I'll address the question in particular about the Greek Catholic Church. I think it was noteworthy in Professor Plokhii's first presentation where he illustrated the concentration of Orthodox in West Ukraine. What's really interesting is back at the end of the Soviet period, the big news was about the triumphal return of the Greek Catholic Church to Ukraine and the legalization of this church. Well, accompanying that church was also the autocephalous movement. And the autocephalists' home base, their cell, was also in West Ukraine, in Lviv. And in fact, their primary activities and their first main movements, the parishes that were the pioneers of reinvigorating the autocephaly movement, were in Lviv, and that remains West Ukraine, their stronghold today. That being said, I also agree with Professor Plokhii that the debate on parish property and the disputes and the legal processes remain instructive for us today. And in that vein, relations between the Greek Catholics and all of the Orthodox Ukrainians have been somewhat strained. Now, you can certainly find examples of good relations in the period immediately following the end of the Soviet Union, but with the creation of the OCU, we see public gestures of attempts at rapprochement and attempts at finding some kind of common ground between the OCU and the UGCC. And this raises a whole number of questions. Will they be able to share space in a multi-religious culture and society in West Ukraine and throughout the west of Ukraine? What are the implications for ecumenical dialogue? We've only seen an initial glimpse, but they also raise questions for how the other Orthodox churches will relate to Catholics. So I think that's definitely something to be carefully observed, because we may be embarking on a new era of interreligious cooperation that is spearheaded by the UGCC and the OCU, but the jury is out, and so we'll see.
And Professor Plokhii, any final comments from you?
Yes, I think unfortunately I have to leave right now, and I really want to thank my fellow speakers and everyone who organized that panel. I'm sorry I have to run.
Well, this is actually my fault as moderator because we're already past our time. But let me thank you and all the other panelists for joining us. And let me remind the audience that the next panel, which starts at 11:45, will be on a different Zoom link. So if you